Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. After seeing the response to the previous intertextuality dealing with a woman who almost drowned in her vehicle, I've decided to dedicate separate episodes and separate analysis to separate areas of intertextuality. This analysis will span a mini-series of 3 to 4 episodes. In the final analysis, I'll cover the live that I meant to do last night. So to be explicit, in this series we're going to examine a few separate areas in order to fathom difficult and currently unknown facets of the Kiely Rodni case. In this episode we'll be looking at the telemetry through the Windsor Hills crash, which occurred on August 4th, a Thursday, the day before the party at Prosser Lake. The accident occurred in a suburb of Los Angeles, California, about 500 miles south of Truckee, and this is video footage of that accident. Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, and hit the thanks icon if you're appreciating this or enjoying this content. Also, a reminder to be vigilant about where you get your information from. When dealing with a source, always ask, are they qualified? Are they credible? Do they have a quality track record? Which is another way of asking, do they have sufficiently high standards as an authority or an expert? Or in layman's terms, ask what Kiely's mother asked at the celebration this past Saturday. Is it kind? Is it true? Is it helpful? And let's get started. So to prep ourselves for our subject matter, we need to define 3 terms: telemetry, telematics, and metadata. Now, telemetry is defined as the automated communications processes from multiple data sources. It's sometimes used to improve customer experiences, also deals with monitoring, security, etc., quality control, and so on. Telematics is different. Telematics is the monitoring of cars, trucks, and equipment using GPS technology, but importantly here, onboard diagnostics, also known as OBD, to plot the movement of a particular vehicle, but also how it is moving, what is actually taking place. It's also known as the black box of a vehicle. And then there's metadata. Metadata is known as a set of data that describes and gives information about other data. Metadata is useful when referring to photography. That's usually when I refer to it, when I'm talking about the metadata in photos and to some extent CCTV. But it can also be relevant when looking at browser history. So the contents of Kiely's laptop might be metadata worth examining. Personally, I feel metadata is an overused term in true crime. I think it's popular amongst blowhards who are trying to sound smart, and it's not a term I think we want to conflate with telematics or telemetry. Telemetry is different to telematics in that sensor readings are measured remotely. So, for example, on spaceships, certain guidance and other features may be determined not so much by the spaceship, but somewhere else, by mission control on the ground. In this case, we want to examine the intertextualities of telematics via the Windsor Hill crash. What were the telematics of that vehicle? What do they tell us about what was going on? Was it an accident? Was it driver error? Did something go wrong with the vehicle itself? Did the driver try to mitigate the accident? Did she try and slow down? Did she try and swerve out of the way? Did she have a seizure? Well, telematics is going to determine the answer. So, how does the investigation into the Windsor Hills crash jibe or not jibe with the Kiely Rodni incident? That's intertextuality. Now, according to the LA Times, quote, images from the scene show massive front-end damage to the Mercedes that the defendant was driving. It rammed headfirst into a light pole after sort of going right through traffic that was sort of moving through the intersection. A law enforcement source told the Times that Linton suffered a broken foot and broken wrist in the collision, but the car's advanced airbag systems for a front-end collision seem to have shielded her from the worst of the impact. So she suffered a broken foot and broken wrist and a little bit of skin damage to her arm. Other people, I think 6 people died in that same incident. Now, firstly, in terms of investigating a case that is going to be prosecuted, that's going to court, and by the way, this case, although it happened a day before the Kiely Rodni incident, the perpetrator, the defendant, has already actually appeared in court. That's how quickly law enforcement can move. That's how quickly all of this data can be sort of compiled into a report and dealt with and acted upon. So crime scene photos are crucial in a criminal investigation, while photos and video of a vehicle crash are also vital. It's also important to vehicle accident or vehicle crash investigators to look at photos of the vehicle, footage of the vehicle. So another aspect that's interesting is the defendant had injuries, and also her state of mind is a matter of legal import as well. That's going to determine mitigation or aggravation. In the Kiely Rodni case, it'll be important to determine whether the victim had injuries separate from the impact of the vehicle hitting the water, and also distinct from the impact of being submerged in water within the zoology of a freshwater reservoir. Another important question is whether the Honda's airbags deployed or not. This could have legal import in at least 2 respects. Firstly, if they did deploy, it would suggest that the vehicle hit the water at some speed, which may validate an accident scenario. Secondly, if they didn't deploy and should have, the manufacturer could potentially be liable, particularly if you consider that such airbags could potentially provide flotation in addition to ordinary protection from blunt force trauma. Now, of course, if they didn't deploy, that also opens the door to potential foul play. Was the vehicle pushed into the reservoir? In the Windsor Hills crash, the merits of the trial may also determine whether various insurance policies pay out, including car insurance, life insurance, and medical cover. So the ambit of the investigation into what happened to Kiely Rodni could also determine whether certain insurance policies pay out, including car insurance. But the part that we really want to deal with here is telematics. What are the telematics of Nicole Linton's Mercedes-Benz E-Class Coupe reveal about what is going on inside the vehicle? Basically, we want to look at the digital breadcrumbs inside the crash. In a way, you can see the crash from the outside, what is going on the inside. Well, according to the LA Times, quote, a specialized CHP accident investigation team is extracting data from the Mercedes' computers that capture speed, braking, and acceleration. So the onboard computer is actually going to be able to tell you speed. Did she brake? Was she accelerating? That team worked through the weekend preparing an investigation for prosecutors who specialize in handling deadly vehicular incidents. So just to be clear, the CHP stands for California Highway Patrol. It's the same agency tasked with investigating the Kiely Rodni case. And you can imagine with a case like the Linton case, their workload is obviously pretty high. And besides the Linton case, there is also the Anne Hesh case that they've had to investigate over the same timeline, over the same time period. Now, if Kiely's Honda's electronic control unit, that's abbreviated sometimes to ECU, electronic control unit, is kind of the black box, if it can provide similar data to the Mercedes in the Windsor Hills incident, if it can show that Kiely tried to brake or indeed the speed the vehicle was going, this alone could confirm or validate whether the vehicle ended up where it did because of an accident. It's not clear whether the ECU might be damaged after 16 days submerged in fresh water. I mean, it is an electronic device water tends not to be good for electronics. Now, according to the LA Times, quote, on Monday, Linton, that's the woman who was driving the Mercedes in the Windsor Hills incident, she appeared in court sitting in a wheelchair while wearing a blue safety vest and a bandage around her left arm. Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Natalie Stone denied her bail, which had previously been set at $9 million at the request of the district attorney's office, which said she's a flight risk. Linton's permanent address is in Texas, and she's currently renting a room in Los Angeles as a traveling nurse. She was set to travel to Hawaii for work, prosecutors said. Now you might say, why do we need to know about her? Why do we need to know anything about the driver? Well, as it turns out, you do find out a bit about driving behavior by getting to know the driver. So it does makes one wonder how was a nurse able to afford a snazzy Mercedes-Benz E-Class coupe? Also, are nurses normally jet setters going to Hawaii, LA, etc.? Anyway, according to NBC News, quote, data from the Mercedes-Benz E-Class coupe that Nicole Linton was driving show she accelerated in the 5 seconds before the multi-vehicle crash on August 4th, going from 122 miles per hour to 130 miles per hour. That's according to a motion filed by the LA County District Attorney's Office and obtained by NBC Los Angeles. End quote. Now, on paper, this suggests Linton did nothing to limit the harm or damage. She didn't try to slow down. She didn't seem to try to avoid the vehicles in front of her. In court, lawyers seem to be arguing that she had a seizure. So if she did nothing, it was because she couldn't do anything, right? Something was going on that was involuntary. She didn't voluntarily and intentionally do what she was doing. The same thing in a way applies to Kiely. Did Kiely voluntarily drive the way that she drove? Did Kiely intentionally drive where she drove? What was the reason why she seemed to be not aware of her surroundings? Well, that same question is being asked in this case. And so the lawyers are arguing that she had a seizure at the time immediately preceding the impact, and this actually caused her foot to depress the accelerator. In other words, she has a seizure, her foot then presses harder against the accelerator. And then the question is, does that make sense? Would most people's feet push down harder on the accelerator, or would it sort of fall off of it? What about other aspects such as holding onto the steering wheel, turning the steering wheel? Now, going back to the NBC News article, quote, the document filed to oppose pre-trial release and bail for Linton, 37 years old, a traveling nurse, also alleged that data showed she did not try to brake or slow down before the impact, right? So we've established that she killed 6 people in a collision where she floored the gas pedal to 130 miles per hour. Now, according to the LA Times, her attorney, Halim Danedina, asked the court to continue Linton's arraignment to October. Obviously, that's next month, because he's reviewing her out-of-state history of documented profound mental health issues, end quote. So that's obviously an aspect that they're kind of going to go into. Another aspect that's quite important is her history as a driver. And I think one could also ask that of Kiely. Had Kiely driven under the influence before? Had Kiely driven in a way where she'd gotten into trouble before? Had Kiely driven late at night before? It would just be interesting to know that. So you can see how instead of intoxication here in the Windsor Hills incident, which appears not to be a factor, it's quite interesting, intoxication is not a factor in this at all. State of mind instead is going to be one aspect used to determine potential culpability. This is also why Kiely's state of mind is important, not so much to determine culpability in her case, but intentionality. What did she intend to do that night? And what was she capable of doing? And what did she do in the end? And so in the same way, you want to look at what was Kiely thinking and saying and doing before the party, what was she thinking and saying and doing during the party, and what was she thinking and saying and doing towards the end, all of that is relevant in the same way in the Nicole Linton case. So just think about it. Linton's behavior prior to the incident are important to try to weave a thread to achieve some kind of psychological parity or continuity going into what appears to be a brainless horror smash. Is there any? The same thing you could say, what was Kiely thinking, or wasn't she thinking? Well, let's try and see if we can find any psychological continuity. Was there any thought process going on? And if there's none at all, then where are we going to find it? So let's go into the before of the Nicole Linton case, dealing with the Windsor Hills crash, right? So before the crash, according to NBC Los Angeles, the district attorney says that Linton admitted she was aware she was experiencing impairment. She knew something was going on in the hours before the crash. Now think about that with regard to Kiely. Did Kiely know that she was intoxicated? Did Kiely know that something was wrong? Did Kiely sort of feel that things weren't quite right? But then she got into a vehicle anyway. So I think there's that aspect to deal with, but there's also the aspect of, well, what about other people? Didn't other people observe Kiely? And shouldn't they have intervened? Same with Nicole Linton. Didn't other people observe her behaving in a strange way? Well, shouldn't they have intervened, right? So responsibility and culpability may not actually rest just with one person, or it may. That's something that's got to be investigated. So apparently Nicole Linton deliberately stopped taking medication that she'd been prescribed because she said she didn't like how the medication made her feel. That seems to be a big part of what we're dealing with here. Prosecutors also say in the court filing, Linton was behaving oddly during her 12-hour nursing shift just prior to the crash. So what is going on in a sort of closed scenario just before the crash? In Linton's case, it's her work, it's within a work situation. That is going to inform what happens immediately after that in a big way. So why is she behaving oddly? Was she emotional? Was she stressed? Or was there some sort of chemical thing that was taking place perhaps in her mind, in her brain, right? What did she say about how she felt, what she intended to do? Then there's the, also sticking to the backstory, the before part of our analysis. She was apparently ticketed 3 times in recent years for speeding. Now, you'd want to have precise details there. Is it within the last months? Is it within the last 1 or 2 years, or is it within the last 10 years? There's a big difference potentially there. But what is interesting is she's been ticketed 3 times for speeding. She also caused 2 other crashes out of state, and apparently, according to prosecutors, has a history of violent behavior. That history of violent behavior could be the worst part of all of that analysis. Now we go to during. And this is, again, where the telematics becomes so valuable. These digital breadcrumbs show that the car's data reveals that Linton was actually holding the steering wheel steady while she sped towards the intersection. She didn't suddenly turn. It didn't become erratic, like she was losing either control or her mind was deviating or she was daydreaming. She was holding the steering wheel steady. The prosecution actually described Linton's driving demeanor, if that's a word, as, quote, NASCAR worthy, right? As if to say that she was extremely steady in her thinking and in her performance. And they say that that flies in the face of the notion that she was unconscious or incapacitated. I find that incredible that the telematics can show the steering wheel didn't turn, which also suggests Linton's hands never left the steering wheel. So if she'd had a seizure, you'd think they would have, wouldn't you? And now we deal with the aftermath. That's also important. The DA's office also says that emergency room doctors who treated Linton immediately after the crash saw no signs that Linton had recently suffered an episode like a seizure or experienced something that would have caused her to be unconscious. Now, if we apply this to the Kiely Rodni case, the aftermath is really going to be looking at her toxicology and to some extent the autopsy. I'll be dealing with that intertextuality in a subsequent video. It'll be the one after this one. Now, that becomes relevant where if the toxicology shows that she's got some drug in her system that would have impaired her, then the blame kind of shifts to that. In other words, you could say some chemical in her brain or in her mind or in her psychology that was interfering with her cognitive process that caused her to drive in an impaired way. That had nothing, it wasn't her fault, right? Something entered her system unknown to her, which impaired her in a way that she could not have expected. And that then has possible consequences for foul play and for somebody else, right? So that is how the possibility of a seizure in the Linton case translates intertextually to Kiely Rodni. The problem is in the Linton case, the telematics are showing that it looks like she didn't have a seizure. Now, by the same token, if the telematics show Kiely was driving also with her hands on the steering and she doesn't really deviate even when she goes down, that would, in a way, if the toxicology doesn't show any substances beyond alcohol, I suppose, it could theoretically show that it also was an accident. Quite difficult calculus. Linton's defense attorney have asked for her to be released, citing Linton's medical and mental health issues. Well, they haven't. Now, according to the Houston Chronicle, quote, on the day of the accident, Linton allegedly appeared naked during a FaceTime call with members of her family. That also goes to immediately before the crash. Right? She appeared naked during a FaceTime call with her own family, and she was on a lunch break from her work at the hospital, right? Now, I think one of the things they're going to be arguing is that she was on some kind of medication meant to treat possibly some kind of mental disorder or mental illness. Now, it's almost the opposite. In Kiely Rodni's case, the idea is, did she have a certain substance in her body that could have impaired her? Here it's almost the opposite. Did she not have a certain substance which was supposed to help her in her thinking? It's quite a weird inversion of that. Do you see that? And so the question then also becomes, if she didn't have this particular substance, Nicole Linton, is that then her fault? If she knew that she needed to have that substance in order to be sensible, right? It's kind of an inversion of don't drink and drive. It's like do certain medication and drive, right? There's another intertextuality dealing with people who have epilepsy that are prohibited from driving. I'm not quite sure what the levels are, but I presume if you're at a very low level and you're on medication, then you can, but I'm certainly not an expert on that. So for someone who claims she is impaired, she seems to be doing a pretty decent job of defending herself in court, though. So remote telemetry is also quite important in this case. You might say that telematics is going to tell you absolutely everything, and there's nothing else of relevance, in terms of that. But there is a kind of remote telemetry that's applicable here, because we've got CCTV video of the incident, right? According to the LA Times, quote, surveillance video just before Thursday's deadly crash shows a dark-colored Mercedes barreling down La Brea Avenue at high speed as dozens of cars cross on Slauson. The Mercedes does not appear to slow before running a red light and slamming into cars in the intersection. So she could theoretically argue, well, you know what, the light was amber or the light had just changed or something like that, right? If there was no CCTV, there could be an argument that the timing of the light changing, or there was an error with the light. When she looked, the light was actually green, and so she didn't make any mistake, right? And of course, CCTV shows that that's not the case. You can actually see that the light had changed some time before and the traffic had moved across some time before. But the CCTV, if that argument came up, totally, rubbishes it. The CCTV showing that the vehicle doesn't slow down is kind of a bit iffy because it's difficult to say for sure, but it certainly is confirmed, is corroborated by the telematics. Do you see how they sort of go hand in hand? The article in the LA Times goes on to say, the car bursts into flames and hurtles into a light pole where it comes to a rest. After the crash, a streak of fire burned on the ground and billowing smoke could be seen from miles away. At least 6 vehicles were involved in the crash, according to the California Highway Patrol investigators. In addition to the fatalities, 8 people were injured. In this particular case, there is a definite legal consequences. They're already playing out. Some people are saying that she could face up to 90 years in prison. She will be charged, I think, with 6 counts of murder. I've sometimes seen 5 counts of murder, but also 5 counts of gross vehicular manslaughter. In a sense, the Linton case feels far worse than the Chris Watts case when you sort of look at it very quickly. Because, around twice as many people were killed. There's also a pregnant woman who dies, and obviously the baby dies as well. Quite heartbreaking. But it's quite interesting that the uproar around the Watts case and his mistress is far worse for that case than this case. Why is that? More people died here in a grotesque and cruel way. Why don't you have a sort of high-profile interest in this case like you had with the Chris Watts case? Why don't you have the same hysteria and just obsessive focus? Well, I think it comes down to motive and intent. Linton likely didn't intend to kill anyone, which means her culpability relative to Chris Watts is relatively less. In other words, Chris Watts committed premeditated murder. I don't think you could say the same for Linton, right? However, that doesn't let her off the hook. Because of her actions, she ought to have known that she could have endangered or threatened the lives of others. The mental health evaluation will determine just how true that ought to have known is. So I'm not going to take it further than that. If this analysis has felt a little bit like a podcast and not a video, that's because these longer videos are quite difficult to, and arduous and labor intensive to sync everything, the pictures to the audio. So I am being a bit lazy. When they more than 20 minutes long, I will be sort of putting in still images, and you can then just listen to the analysis. And you can also decide, no, I'm not going to. This is boring. It's not interesting, and it seems like you're only pushing the foul play narrative. Now, with regards to that, someone said, why don't you do this intertextuality with regard to foul play? The problem is, I don't have a suspect. And most true crime cases do. It's quite obvious. It's like definitely that person or maybe that one. Here we don't really have a suspect. Now, I know you guys will say we do, not according to not the way that I see this case. The other thing is, I don't really see a clear motive. That's another thing that tends to be clear when you look at high-profile cases. You start seeing from social media, from text, from behavior, some dynamics, and nothing has come out very clearly. And again, you might say, no, I can see it is quite clear. I just don't see that. What is clear to you isn't clear to me in that respect. And then the third aspect is evidence. Again, in true crime, you tend to see there's evidence of I wouldn't even call it foul play, of a crime, of murder, of whatever. Here, I don't see any evidence either. Once again, you will say, no, there's definitely evidence, very, very clear. So, just to reiterate, in terms of the foul play thing, intertextually, you need a suspect, you need a motive, and you need evidence. And I feel that it's thin in all three of those aspects. If you can make those three aspects a lot clearer, then you can do your own intertextuality in that, and I'd be interested to see it. I'd be interested to see how strong your intertextual arguments are, if you can make any. Just be sure if you use the word intertextuality to defer to some extent to this channel, because if you're new to this channel and new to this term intertextuality, well, let me explain it. In true crime, we use intertextuality to intuit, in a sense, the fabric that we're dealing with in a particular case. In this case, it's the Kiely Rodni incident, via the fabric or text or circumstances or data of another case. It's a way of gaining insight and a higher level of discernment. It's a more precise way to perceive what we are looking at and also what we're not looking at. So it is actually true crime intertextuality. You might say TCI, right? But that is a uniquely true crime rocket science ism, which means you won't hear anyone else talking about it. It's a term familiar to the true crime rocket science community because it was born and bred here. You're welcome to adopt it yourself. Just acknowledge where you got it from, and then you're welcome to apply it. So if you want to do your own foul play intertextuality series alongside this one or at the same time as this one, you're welcome to do that. Just make sure you say where you got the idea for that sort of thing from. In the next episode, we'll examine intertextuality in an area many are unsure about, in this case, the autopsy and toxicology. That should be pretty interesting. So until then, thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.